Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. A very good afternoon. My name is Mohammed Shalo. I'm the Director of Communication and Strategic Partnerships at the Executive Office of Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorism Financing. I do also chair the AML CFT Public-Private Partnership Forum. I am delighted that the Executive Office of Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorism Financing is the theme sponsor for the inaugural Risk 4.0 Forum, which is held for the first time as a part of Abu Dhabi Finance Week 2023 under the patronage of His Highness Sheikh Khalid bin Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi and Chairman of the Executive Council of Abu Dhabi. I'm equally delighted to have the privilege of being a moderator for this, I would say, great panel and speakers. So let's start with no doubt that financial crime is a global problem. It costs us a lot. It costs the global economy an estimate of $2.1 trillion annually. This is the same size as the GDP of major countries, including some of the G7 countries. And this enormous figure does not include corruption, tax evasion, and cybercrime. I cannot emphasize enough the significant harm that's caused by criminals, from drug trafficking, human trafficking, and environmental and climate change related to crimes. So it's not only about our economy, it's also about our society, security, stability. It's about our future. So what can be done to counter this more successfully? Our panelists today will examine the global governance structures in the fight against financial crime and ask what is working effectively and what can be done more. How we can work more closely on an international level to foster transparency, accountability, and the culture of ethical conduct. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our esteemed guests, and even though they need no introduction, let me start from Dr. Reem Al-Shamsi, who is a Director of Research and Strategic Analysis at the UAE Financial Intelligence Unit. Dr. Reem has over 10 years of professional experience in international financial relations and financial crime prevention. In her role in the FIU, she produced different typology reports, strategic review papers. Prior to the FIU, she was the head of tax information, exchange of tax information at the UAE Ministry of Finance. Dr. Reem holds a PhD in combating the financing of terrorism from the University of Birmingham in UK. Next, Shadi Al-Khouri, who is a Deputy Division Chief, Financial Integrity Group within Legal Department at the International Monetary Fund. Shadi's areas of expertise include anti-money laundering, counter-financing of terrorism, anti-corruption, cross-border governance, and financial integrity issues. Before joining the IMF in 2007, he worked with the Financial Intelligence Unit, SIC, of the Lebanese Central Bank, Banco de Lipan. He received his legal and finance education in Lebanon and France. Next to John Cusack, I think you start with that other side, just the different order. So John Cusack, he is the Global Coalition, the chairman of the Global Coalition to Fight Financial Crime. Globally, as previously held the Global Money Laundering Reporting Officer at UBS and Standard Chartered Bank, and two-time co-chair of the Wolfsberg Group. He's an advisor and a number of financial institutions and RegTech providers, and engaged with NGOs in different areas, including wildlife and human trafficking. Last but not least, David Lewis, who's the Managing Director and Global Head of AML Advisory at Kroll, and the FATF Executive Secretary from 2015 up until January 2022. David did the AML policy for the UK government before going to lead the FATF and represented in the G7 and G20. He was voted as the Financial Crime Fighter of the Year by the Global Coalition to Fight Financial Crime, and now he is a fellow at RUSI Center for Financial Crime and Securities Studies in addition to his role. So let me start with the first question. Is basically an open question to all panelists. What has been the most significant development in 2023 when it comes to global governance and why? Perhaps start with an international perspective for Shadi coming from the International Monetary Fund. What do you see globally? Then we go to the other panelists. Shadi, to you, please.
Thanks a lot, Mohammed, and it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you again for the Executive Office for the invitation, for inviting the IMF to be here at this important event. On your question on developments, I think maybe I'll take a broader perspective on the last decade and what has been done by the Financial Action Task Force. Since we're talking about risk, I think when you think about risk, you could fragment it into three pillars. You have every country, we have 190 members country at the IMF, is facing different risks in relation to money laundering and terrorism financing. So when you look at the three pillars, I think you have the threat that the country is facing, you have the vulnerabilities of the AML-CFT framework, and usually if you have high threat, your system is vulnerable or you don't have proper defenses, it materializes into impact. So I'll talk a little bit about those three pillars and what we have seen in the last decade, where we are and the developments that are happening now in the international community. I think that in 2012, the FATF required countries do your exercise, understand better your risks, because when you understand better your risk, you could face the financial crimes and fight them more effectively. And a lot of national risk assessment have been produced in the last 10 years. If you look at the body of all the country national risk assessment, you could see that I think most countries got it right on the vulnerability side. They understand whether their framework, anti-money laundering and combating terrorism financing frameworks are strong or not too strong, and in which areas. But I think the gap where we're at the IMF trying to fill now, in partnership with all other international and regional organizations as part of the global framework, is can we get better at understanding the threats, and can we get better at understanding the impact? And I will say a little bit more on those two areas. For the threats, I think when you think about it, you have to understand better what are you facing at the country level. And I think what we have seen is often countries say, okay, we have widespread corruption or tax evasion, organized crimes, drug trafficking, domestic. They look more at domestic, but I think they're missing the cross-border element, which is very common in money laundering operations. Then you have to look at the country. Is it like a country? What's the business model? How is it linked to the economy of the country? What are the main threats that are facing us on the cross-border? Is it like a country where proceeds of crimes are originating and they are laundered in the jurisdiction or leave the jurisdiction? Is it a jurisdiction mostly used for the funding to transit, or is it an end destination? And dig deeper into what threats you are facing. I think one big threat that we are seeing now, discussing across, including in this forum, is the emerging threats from new technologies and so on. They present opportunities, but they also present threats. So what we're pushing countries to do is being more granular, more in-depth analysis of what threats are you facing. And then the next step is what I mentioned, is that often they have understanding of the vulnerabilities. I think the FATF reports present a very good mapping of the vulnerabilities, but they're not often acting on them fast enough. And the third pillar, which is the impact of those crimes, and here I think it's ill-defined in a sense. In the IMF, we adjusted our policy to say maybe the impact have to be more granular, the impact on the macroeconomy. Like what's the impact on the fiscal? What's the impact on the monetary policy? What's the impact on your financial sector and the stability soundness of the financial sector and the structure reform? Is it impacting your growth? Maybe you could see benefit of the dirty money on the economy in the short term, but it will create bubbles and busts, and reputation risk and medium term inequalities and many other factors. So I think our new strategy at the fund, and that's I think the challenge, going back to your question, that we will be looking at the next 5 years, can we deepen our analysis on threats? Can we deepen our analysis on vulnerabilities and impact, and have a better way of assessing the risk so we could fight the financial crimes better? And I think that will help bridging the gap between AML-CFT practitioners and the policymakers in the country, whether they are ministers of finance deciding on the budget or governors, to say, okay, this is necessary because not only we're fighting crimes because it's affecting people, but also it's affecting the economy and how it's affecting the economy. But I'm happy to talk more about that. Thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you, Shahid. I think that's give a good segue from that international perspective, global, what's happening, to maybe go take now to the domestic. Dr. Reem, you're heading the, I would say, the function responsible for typologies. What's happening? The UAE has been going through a transformational changes, I would say, in the last 2 years. But in 2023, this question, in terms of the governance, what you have been seeing in, I would say, the most significant developments?
Well, I will start first with a brief, development in terms of global governance overall. It's about the rising power of private sector and third actors. It's about moving, again, not only from technical compliance to effectiveness, but from effectiveness to sustainability of implementation and compliance with international standards. During the past 2 to 3 years, we have learned many lessons, starting from the importance of international both international and national cooperation. The UAE has been showing considerable effort when it's come to collaboration with international counterpart at the global level, or when it's come to domestic cooperation between or among national authorities to bring criminal to justice, starting from understanding our own risk of financial crime, also reporting suspicious transaction to empower investigation, freezing and seizing assets of criminals, as well as is having a strong law that enable prosecuting criminals. Another lesson that has been learned during the past period, it's also the role of public-private partnership. Global governance, it's about the shift from hierarchy to, again, best practices and soft laws, and the concept of regulation by networks or policy networks. The idea of delegation, the implementation and the compliance of global standard to private sector actors, while governments recognize themselves in a more decentered and decentered horizontal, let's say, forms. So the UAE again has been doing great work in this area, whether through the subcommittee of PPP or the periodic roundtable conducted by the UAE FIU with reporting entities, or overall outreach sessions by supervisory authorities. And that brings me to the idea again, over the past few years, we have seen the idea of the culture of compliance, how it's developed over time. So now all practitioners almost in the field, they will recognize the concept of that non-compliance or the cost of non-compliance exceeds the cost of compliance. And that's a huge development. Another development that it's happening, or the greatest one, I think, in my opinion, is actually understanding the financial crime risk at the national level. And today the UAE in the process of completing its second national risk assessment, which reflects maturity of understanding as well as the capability of identifying our own national risk associated with the financial sector. Just to touch a little bit quickly on the technology, since this is one of the theme, not only in this event, but of the week, I think also on the fintech in general. Technology, it's again, when we talk about global governance, technology is one of the core elements of globalization that enables the spread of financial crime overall. With its benefit, still we identify different patterns of financial crime using technology. As FIU, for example, identified different typologies related, for example, to fraud, including fraud scams or romance fraud or email compromises or phishing using new techniques such as deepfake. We also linked how technology relate or new modern, let's say, or modern social platform relate to drug trafficking and the potential use of drug trafficking dark webs in drug trafficking, supply chain globally. And another area, of course, is
I think
abuse of
yeah,
virtual assets.
too many happening exactly in terms
Yeah,
of development.
so just to sum up, I think again about technology, it might have empowered the criminal to implement their plans, but also empowers us and our defense and mitigation measure to overcome or deal and tackle the problem of financial crime in general. So.
Thank you, Toria. David, to you, and I would like maybe to refer also here to your former role as a FATF Executive Secretary. So what you have seen, the global governance scene changes since the implementation, also the effectiveness methodology 2013. What this led to different changes in the, I would say, global area. What would you say here?
Thanks, Mohammed. I'll keep it fairly brief. I want John to speak. I think we can't underestimate the impact of geopolitics, and I think we've seen that in 2023 on our global efforts to fight financial crime. You look at the EU impact and the growing impact of the EU. They're launching an EU anti-money laundering authority. If you are on a FATF list, you're automatically put on an EU list, and that means that you have to do enhanced due diligence on countries you're doing business in, if they're on that list. That's geopolitics at work. That's not what FATF requires. And then you've got sanctions and the impact of unilateral sanctions and how that's leading to a fragmentation of the global framework for fighting financial crime. And we're seeing the emergence of the global south and the enlargement of the BRICS. And all of this is in context of leaders around the world. Kroll did a survey this year where we asked leaders about how their understanding of financial crime risks, and they all see financial crime risks increasing and getting more complicated. And at the same time, they're investing more and more in technology. And that brings about a whole new set of risks in and of itself. So that's the context I think we're seeing in 2023. In terms of the FATF's role and effectiveness and where we go next, we started from a very low base, basically asking countries back in 2012, do you understand your risks? We now need to think about how globally do we understand risks, not just at a national level, and what we use as the indicator for those risks. Because the FATF grey list, for example, was never intended to be an indicator of risk. So I think the FATF needs to think about the effectiveness of the global system for tackling money laundering and terrorist financing, and not just continue to focus on national efforts.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. I think the point of the national assessment is that many jurisdictions or regions now thinking of this cross-jurisdictional risk assessments or geographical regional risk assessments. I think, John, the Global Coalition is one of the most, I would say, prestigious NGOs and engaging heavily with the international community and also the private sector. What you would have seen in terms of these developments and changes? I know you have views also on some of the certain threats coming from fraud area and that you have shared. So please, to you.
Thank you, Mohammed. The point of this session is avoiding cracks in global governance on important issues like financial crime. That assumes it's all joined up and that these fissures are opening up, which is actually the reverse. That's not true. We have significant gaps in our ability to be able to combat financial crime, which is different to fighting money laundering and different to fighting terrorism finance and different for fighting proliferation finance. So we talk 95% of the time about the activities of FATF for good reason, but FATF is not the Financial Action Task Force on fraud. It is not the Financial Action Task Force on financial crime. It is the Financial Action Task Force on the money side of the crime, which is only a piece of it. It was meant to get us home and hosed in relation to fighting criminals, but it has not done so after 35 years, even though there's been a lot of support for it. From a portrait perspective, obviously sanctions compliance is a huge issue this year. Terrorism finance will become a big issue too. Fraud and scams is enormous, which I'll come on to. And also virtual assets, of course, takes up a huge amount of time and energy because we're focused much more on the money than we are focused on the crime. That's why it's taking up an inordinate amount of time and space. From a landscape perspective, this fraud and scams issue is now the fastest growing crime in the world by far. We're all affected by it all of the time. There is no global approach to fighting fraud. There isn't one. FATF is not looking at it, even though it published a typology report on fraud and scams last week or 2 weeks ago. The way to attack fraud and scams is by prevention. Once you've been scammed, getting your money back is going to be very difficult indeed. FATF is interested in typologies for banks and others in relation to spotting and then following money. It's too late. So who is responsible in the world for preventing fraud and scams? Who is going to talk to the Microsofts of the world, the Googles of the world, and the Facebooks of the world, who are professional fraud enablers in many cases, not intentionally but inadvertently, in relation to their services that they provide to scammers who will try and rip us all off? Who is doing that? There isn't anybody. Right? So global governance is weak in relation to the fight against financial crime, the fight against fraud, the fight against corruption, the fight against human trafficking, the fight against all those predicate offenses, but not against the money. But the money has not been effective enough to get us home. We need to also think about the crime as well and bring all these agencies together and have a financial action task force on fraud, financial crime, and money laundering.
Thank you. Get some still time for follow-up questions. Maybe I will go back, David, but from your other hat, you spoke the least, so maybe start with you again, then go. I will just quote what Dr. Reem highlighted about the cost of compliance and also about the use of technology. And we are in this venue talking about I would say, the fourth industrial revolution. So how we can look at technology either as, I would say, an enabler to mitigate risks, or the virtual assets, everyone talking about as, I would say, a key threat to the financial system and the financial stability. So how do you look at this? You're working with different jurisdictions. So how you look at the role of technology?
So technology, I think, has the potential today to completely transform the effectiveness of our anti-financial crime measures. But it also presents a risk. And quite often what we're seeing, particularly as firms look to cut back on their costs for other reasons, they're getting rid of people and they're looking to replace people with technology, but it's technology they don't understand or that they're not tuning properly. And if you're talking about artificial intelligence, then it's learning off previous practice. And if previous practice is wrong or not finding where the money laundering is, then you're just optimizing stupid. So I think there's huge potential for technology, but you have to understand how to use it and the risks that it introduces, as well as the potential benefits.
Thank you. Shadi, you spoke about the IMF approach, what has been done in terms of the outlook in the coming few years. How do you look at this in terms of, I would say, your coverage of the region in particular?
That brings us, I think, the question of what we do at the IMF. I think overall we have three functions, and one of them is the IMF is going to every single country every year to check the health of the economy, of the macroeconomy. And then the question is becoming more common and common that it's not only discussing, the budget and the fiscal and the monetary policy and so on. It's also discussing how financial crimes are negatively impacting the economy. So one thing we're increasing coverage is we're trying to understand the risk and context of every member. And when we discuss with the Minister of Finance and the governor whether the economy is doing well or not, we have to discuss also how and why they have to tackle better the financial crimes, because it has negative macroeconomic implications. So I think more specifically for the region, we're trying to understand better the different dynamics. You have in the region countries that are fragile or conflict affected states, but you have also emerging and getting into advanced, more emerging economies. So the question, can we understand better the dynamics in the region and see how we could convince them to fight it more effectively and continue investing heavily into the effectiveness of the AML-CFT frameworks? I think many countries are there, but there's still a huge gap across the region, 22 countries. The second one is one function of the IMF is when we provide financing. The country is already into financial crisis, and they have to do often difficult reforms to get out of it. And often when we see that they are lacking and they are in the crisis because they already made mistakes in the process, we include conditionality in dialogue with the authorities to make that reform happen. And for the region, we'll continue doing it to the extent they come to us for financing. But I think the third function is the one that will keep us very busy, is capacity development and helping the authorities meet raise capability of their authorities, whether they are FIUs, supervisors, law enforcement, how they work together, how they understand better the risk, how they make the system more effective. I think just to conclude on that, we have a workshop this week here in Abu Dhabi to discuss the rising risks of virtual assets and how supervisors could supervise them more effectively and tackle the risks. But fully agree with David's point on also the opportunities of the technology that we are also using and leveraging at the IMF to understand better the risk and context and what countries are facing. But thanks a lot, Mohammed.
Thank you, Shadi. Perhaps go back to John before concluding with Dr. Reem. Is the role of the private sector, this is also Dr. Reem quoting here now again, the role of the private sector, John, you have spent a long time, over 3 decades in the private sector. How do you see the evolving role of the private sector in this, I would say, journey to fight financial crime?
Yeah, look, we've come a long way. 30 years ago, I was a lawyer for a bank in London, and law enforcement would send you a court order, and you would respond to it absolutely to the legalese. So that if they were asking you for Mohammed Charlo and he wasn't the account holder but the beneficial owner, you'd say you didn't have Mohammed Charlo. That was 30 years ago. Now it's completely the opposite. We'll tell you if it's Mohammed Charlo plus if we have his relatives plus if we have connections or other business interests. When we started out there was this big concern about the integrity of the financial system, which is still at the heart of what FATF is trying to achieve, albeit we've won that battle. Right? Banks may not be perfect and the finance system may not be perfect. It never will, but it probably won't be more and have more integrity than it's got now. It's probably quite towards the top end. And the fact that cooperation is significant, public-private partnerships that you lead here in the region are excellent. That's obviously the first one in the region here, but we've been working closely across the private sector, the public sector, for at least probably about a decade at least. And I think we're at the high point of that, moving into new ways of working, including using new forms of technology. So I'm pretty happy with where we are, Mohammed. I'm just not happy we're getting enough out of it. And I don't think that we can necessarily assume that the private sector on its own, even by doing more, will be enough to get us where we want to get to. I do think there's more of the private sector need to join in different spaces. I've mentioned that on fraud. But I also think we will never be able to fight financial crime successfully without also a successful, determined public sector as well.
Thank you, John. I think we have almost 2 minutes. So Dr. Reem, what are, I would say, some remarks you would like to do from UAE Financial Intelligence Unit, what you are saying in terms of your vision, and also the different, I would say, projects you are working in the country. So I would leave it to you.
I will highlight again, maybe Mohammed, if I may, the role of technology again, since this is the theme. Today, all UAE authorities as well as the private sector realize the power of innovation and the role of technology and AI system, and we are trying to adapt to all systems that enable us to identify criminal behavior and detect their hidden connection. So technology is a key, and if I may conclude with one frequent quote used in the literature of financial crimes, that criminals are always ahead of us. I think we need not to start, actually we are late somehow, but we need to actually change our perception and this equation. And technology definitely is a key to, whether against fraud or any other type of financial crime today, it's something that a must to do or must have, whether in public or private sector. So
yeah, can't disagree. Well, thanks. I think that maybe in 30 seconds that's left, I can just maybe conclude the 3 key takeaway points. Is that first is our response to fraud as the fastest growing predicate crime, that we need a more coordinated approach to tackle fraud risks. The second, which is also related to fraud, is not anymore just conventional fraud, but electronic digital fraud. So emerging threats raised from cyber-related threats. This is something we need to look at, digital ID and digital fraudulent ID and so on and so forth. And the third is the public-private partnership. Is that something not only about sharing intelligence, because that the perception usually is that the public will just get intelligence. It's really about trust, engaging with the private sector to get them more into the policy development process because they know in terms of the day-to-day business. I think that's a fantastic discussion. We could spend double of this time talking about these, but with respect also to the other sessions, please do join me in greeting the panelists. Thank you very much.